Ahoy, mateys, landlubbers, and scalawags. And welcome to the Hidden Creek Manor. So if you guys couldn't tell by the intro, this episode is going to focus on the pirate section of our haunt, the section that we like to call Kraken's Cove. So with a name like Kraken's Cove, we probably have a Kraken in that section of the haunt, which luckily we do. The Kraken was built by the lady of the manor a few years ago. It's super cool. It looks like there's these Kraken tentacles coming out from the ground or from the water, attacking the pirate ship and all the skeleton pirates. But, it's called Kraken's Cove, and we only have, I think, 3 Kraken tentacles. So we've always wanted to expand on that and have more of a Kraken presence in the pirate section of our haunt. But we just couldn't figure out what we wanted to do or take the time to build more tentacles. So luckily this year, Lowes released a Kraken. So rather than try to build our own, we bought the Lowes Kraken. But now we have a new problem. Our Kraken tentacles are red and orange and yellow, and the suckers, I don't know, the little sucker things on an octopus tentacle. I'm sure there's a scientific word for them, but I'm sure I could Google it as well, but I don't know what that word is. So for this episode, we're just going to call them suckers. But anyway, the suckers on our tentacles are like a tealish color, and the Lowes Kraken is black. Its suckers are kind of a grayish color, and the suckers light up. Our Kraken does not light up. So how can we combine our existing Kraken tentacles with the Lowes Kraken to create kind of an ultimate Kraken display? Well, before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about our current tentacle issue. And even before we get into that, let's talk about how we built our tentacles, because we didn't have a YouTube channel when the lady of the manor built this. And if you guys wanted to create your own Kraken tentacles, you might want to know how to do it yourself. So let's quickly go over how to build some Kraken tentacles of your own. First, let's talk about the supply list. You would need a wooden base, some chicken wire, some heavy-duty plastic and some duct tape, and a pool noodle, and spray paint. And then essentially what you do is you take that wooden base, you attach the chicken wire to the bottom of it, and then you shape that chicken wire into the tentacle that you like. You then wrap that with the heavy-duty plastic and tape it up, spray paint it, take your pool noodle, cut it up, and attach those suckers to the tentacle. So now that we've talked about how we built our tentacles, let me talk to you about the issue with them. You see, because they are just kind of plastic and chicken wire, they're very flexible and they can bend and move, so that spray paint chips off, whether it be from the weather or from just touching them or the transport back and forth between storage and our haunt. They take a lot of wear and tear, and it is a pain in the ass to keep them updated. We have to repaint them every year. So now we need to figure out, how can we update our current tentacles to make sure that they stay the same year after year? We don't have to go back and repaint them and touch them up over and over and over again. So the first part of this video, we're going to do just that. We are going to make sure that our tentacles that we've built previously last. Then we're going to update our tentacles to match the Lowes Kraken. And then lastly, we are going to paint all of the tentacles and the Lowes Kraken to have a uniform paint job. So there's a lot to go over in this video, so let's just jump straight into it. So now that we got the prep work out of the way, let's go over the supplies that we're going to use to update our current Kraken tentacles. So we used plaster gauze, Drylock, multiple types of spray paint, which we'll get further into as we get into the build, LED light strips, and bubble wrap. So the first thing that we did was take the plaster gauze and cut it into strips about 1.5 feet long. There's not an exact science to this, so just whatever works for you whenever you decide to go through this build. But like I said, for us, about 1.5 feet. per strip, and you just want to cut a bunch of these strips. And then you also want to have some water ready, and then you'll just take these strips one at a time, get them wet. I wouldn't suggest getting them soaking wet, but just get a decent amount of water on there, and then just apply them to the Kraken tentacle. And then just continue repeating the process until you have that entire tentacle wrapped in plaster. Now, we ended up doing 2 coats of the plaster wrap. And one thing I wanted to kind of show, at least in somewhat detail here, is that whenever you do add those plaster strips, you want to make sure that your hands are kind of wet as well, at least your fingertips. And then whenever you put those strips on there, you really want to kind of make it as smooth as possible. So work on the end pieces and kind of smooth those in. Try to connect it to the existing plaster as much as possible. You also want to try to eliminate as many of those small holes that are in that plaster just by spreading water over them and using your fingers to kind of work that into the plaster. And then even on the edges, you want to just kind of try to blend it in as much as possible whenever you are adding those plaster strips. And this can take quite a bit of time to dry, especially on the second coat. I think it took almost 2 days for it to be completely dry so we can move on to the next step, which is painting over it with Drylock. So once that plaster dries, it does make these way more durable, but we still need to make sure that they're weatherproof. So with the Drylock, that's going to not only protect that plaster and keep it waterproof, but also it adds a little bit of texture as well. Now, if you watched our other previous videos that we've used Drylock, it's typically to make something look like it's made out of rock or concrete, because it does have those small specks in it. But with the Kraken, those small specks give it kind of like a skin texture, like a rough sea creature texture. So it works out well for the Kraken. You could use monster mud in place of Drylock, but like I said, I just like that texture of the Drylock. It's also easier to use than making my own monster mud. So we just covered all the tentacles in Drylock. And similar to the plaster, with Drylock we did 2 coats. And then once those coats of Drylock are dry, it's time to move on to the paint process. So we're going to do a base of black, and whenever we applied the spray paint to the tentacles, we would leave out the section where we're going to be adding our lights and the bubble wrap. So really, at this point, we just want to focus on the outer parts of the tentacle. So just take some black spray paint and just coat the whole thing with that outline ready, so that way we know where to put the bubble wrap and the lights when we get to that step.
Now, we are members of quite a few different Halloween decorating groups online, and we've seen a lot of other haunters take this Lowes Kraken that's just kind of a flat black color and give it a paint job to make it look more like it's this color changing from green and purple and gold and black. It's a really cool effect. It makes it look shiny, almost like it's wet from being under the water. And, you know, black, even if you're shining haunt lights on it, it's not going to turn out very well at night. So we want to have something that makes the Kraken pop. So we're going to do the same thing. So let's get into the paint job.
And then once that base coat of black is dry, then we can move on to the color changing paint. So the first coat that we added was a color changing paint that went from green to purple. After adding that coat, we added a second coat, this one with green to gold. Now, this is something that you can kind of play around with. It's completely up to you. Get artistic with this, get creative.
I ended up doing, I think, 2 coats of the green to purple, 1 coat of the green to gold, and just kind of went back and I would look at things and add a little bit of paint here and there. But really, this is completely up to you, whatever look you're going for, however many coats you need. But that color changing paint is really cool once it dries, and it depends on the light that hits it as to what color the tentacles actually look like. And then once the paint dries, it's time to move on to the bubble wrap.
Actually, before we get into the bubble wrap and lights, I wanted to explain why we're using bubble wrap. You see, the original suckers that we had, the ones that were made out of pool noodles, actually would have probably matched up with the Lowes suckers a little bit better if we just plastered over them. But if we'd done that, I don't know how we would have gotten the lights to shine through it. So instead of using the existing suckers, we decided to go with the bubble wrap route. The bubble wrap, the little tiny bubbles look like a bunch of little suckers, and we can then have the light shine through those. So it won't match the Lowes Kraken perfectly, but at night, no one's probably going to notice the difference. And even in the day, if they get that close and look at our Kraken and say, well, these ones have bubble wrap and these ones don't, I mean, who cares? So let's get back to it.
So I took the bubble wrap and just kind of taped it on the tentacle over that gray section. And then once I got it in place, I then used that gray section that I could see behind the bubble wrap as a stencil. So that way I knew how large of a piece of bubble wrap I needed to cut. So I just marked that out with a Sharpie and then cut the bubble wrap to that shape. And then after cutting the bubble wrap, I applied the paint. We actually used 2 different kind of grayish or tannish colors. We looked at the Lowes Kraken and tried to match up as much as possible with the colors. So we found 2 different types of bear spray paint that we used. I did the first coat as more of that tannish color, and then I added some accents with the darker gray. And then while the paint's drying on the bubble wrap, I went ahead and set up the LED light strips. So we got these green LED light strips off of Amazon. I will put a link in the description. They do plug in, which is something that's important. A lot of times LED light strips will only plug into like a USB. So we wanted to make sure that we have some LED light strips that are outdoor, but also that can actually be plugged in. And the sticky backing on the back of these light strips, I've never been successful with this sticky backing. It hardly ever does the job. So we use some hot glue to kind of assist with that. So I would just put a dab of hot glue on the back of the light strip, hold it in place, move up the tentacle a little bit, apply some more hot glue, and just went up and down the gray section just to give it as much coverage as we can. So that way those light strips, whenever they shine behind the bubble wrap, will be more of a uniform green color. And then now that we have those light strips complete and the paint is dry on the bubble wrap, it's time to apply the bubble wrap to the Kraken. So we're going to use a mixture of super glue and hot glue for this. The super glue is water activated, so I just sprayed some water on the bubble wrap first, and then just applied a bunch of super glue to the side that will be sticking to the tentacle, so the flat side of the bubble wrap. And then as I was applying it, I was using hot glue to hold it in place, since that super glue does take some time to cure. And then after gluing that bubble wrap to the tentacle, I needed something to apply pressure to make sure that that super glue sticks and holds properly, but nothing too heavy because I didn't want to pop the bubbles in the bubble wrap. So we had a bunch of spray paint. So I used those spray paint cans to hold down the bubble wrap so that way that super glue could properly dry. So we've got all of our existing tentacles in different phases of the build. We have
bubble wrap cut. We have some that have been painted, some that have been dry locked. So while that's all kind of happening in the background, let's move on to the Lowes Kraken, and we'll go over how we painted the Lowes Kraken to match our existing tentacles. Now, the Kraken from Lowes looks really cool, but it's more of a flat black. Now, during the daytime, I'm sure it's going to look great, but at night, with the haunt lights on, just shining a haunt light on a flat black object, it's not really going to show off a whole lot. Now, the tentacles do have kind of a green light up on the sucker side of the tentacle, but we wanted to do something that really makes the Kraken stand out. So we went with that color changing spray paint that we used earlier. But before applying that paint, we had to tape off the tentacles to make sure that we're only applying the paint to the sections that are black. And then with the Kraken head, those eyes, we don't want those to be painted, so we taped off the eyeballs as well. And with everything taped off, it's time to get to work. So we started applying that color changing paint. So you can even see here, just as we're applying it, it's already creating more of a shiny look, more like the Kraken would be wet from coming out of the water, and then also giving it that kind of green, purple, and gold effect that changes in the light, so it makes the Kraken stand out a lot more. And as you move around and the light hits it in different areas, we get that blending of different colors. So it's a really cool effect that can really make this Kraken pop in our haunt. And you can see here just how much of a difference that makes from that flat black to that shiny look from that color changing paint. So now that we have our existing Kraken tentacles complete, the Lowes Kraken has been painted. Now it's time to apply the final step, which is just a coat of clear spray paint. We went with a semi-gloss just to make it give that little bit more of a wet look, and also to seal in those colors and make sure that it stays protected from the elements. And at this point, we're done. So let's take a look at the final results.
Alright guys, that's going to do it for this episode. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I am super pumped about having this Kraken in our haunt this year. And if you guys want to see us set up the Kraken and see what it looks like in the haunt, you might want to consider watching our Decoration Day video whenever it launches. And if you want to be notified of when that video launches, you might want to consider subscribing to the channel. But we're going to go ahead and wrap things up for now. So happy haunting, and we'll see you in the next one.
Congratulations. You made it to the end of the video. As a reward for sticking around, you may now watch one of these two videos. The choice is yours, but choose wisely.